Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we are back with Autobiography of a Freedom Rider. I about forgot the name of the book, but just hold it up. Look at this. Anyway, let's jump back into this where we left off here. My parents were great role players when they needed to be. They knew that it was easier to let white folks think they were satisfied with conditions as they were. They knew that if they alone rejected those conditions, they could no longer feed their families. They would no longer be able to get loans for new trucks, the best prices for logs or pulpwood, nor to have a peace of mind in knowing that they could transport a load of logs without getting a traffic ticket. They knew that they were the source of income for other blacks in the community who had to feed their families, so they played the role. The Klan was known to exist in our area, so black homeowners almost always kept a firearm within reach. If the Klan ever attacked a family or one of its members, the cowards who covered their faces would not live to talk about it. One night, one of the horses that Dad used in his logging business escaped from the barn and ran out onto the highway into the path of a truck and was hit and killed. The white male driver of the truck became incensed and warned that he and his friends would return. Dad and I camped outside the house for 2 nights with rifles and shotguns. He put me on notice to be ready with my crack shot. They will probably have sheets on, and we don't want to hurt anyone, but if they come into the yard, see that they don't leave. I shrugged, somewhat disagreeing with them, yet felt it was better to be alive than dead. Had the men returned, no matter what the outcome may have been, I know that I would not be here today. We had only a few guns and could have easily been outnumbered. Thousands of black Mississippians were migrating north in the early 1950s. At the same time, thousands, if not more, never gave a thought to leaving. Those in the latter group were usually landowners, the people who loved the land. Put simply, land had been too hard to come by to walk away and leave it. We had been descended from an enslaved people for whom possession of the ground they farmed was equivalent to freedom. I think my dad would have died a quick death if someone had taken his land. Next to his mother and wife, his 40 acres was his life. Our family had inherited an additional 40 acres from my birth father's ancestors, which was adjacent to the land Dad owned. As much as Dad loved the land, he hated farming. Be that as it may, he would still plant 3 acres of cotton every year. He didn't care if he made 3 bells or 0 bells. To make use of the land was a measure of responsibility and demonstrated economic independence. The fact that he would go outside and spit on what belonged to him mattered. He wasn't the only one. My mother's first cousin, Willie Armstrong, who lived next to us, loved his property so much he would go outside and preach to the land, the cows, and the horses. They had been so good to him. In all other ways he was fine, but occasionally he loved to preach to his belongings. The little farming Dad did was just enough to cover living expenses, food for the table, hay for the horses and cattle. The cattle herd amounted to 30 to 50 head at any one time and included the Brahmin, the ones with humps on their backs. The only reason Dad hired that type was because he loved to look at them. The Brahmin bull we owned was the meanest I'd ever seen. If he saw you walking in the pasture, he'd take off and chase you. I learned to drive at age 8, standing on my feet in the cab of the tandem axle truck. My legs were too short to reach the accelerator and brakes um, sitting down, so Dad would instruct me as I stood um, against the seat to steer the truck around the fields and pastures on our farm. By age 12, I had been driving for some time and would sometimes transport the horses to Dad's work site the night before he needed them. Driving a 1-ton Ford pickup, I would make 2 trips with 2 horses each time and then rope off the staging area. When all the timber was cut, I would go back and get them. Dad always kept 2 large mules and 4 large Clydesdale horses, all of which he needed to operate his logging business. Sometimes the 2 mules would be used for tilling the soil in the garden and the hayfields. Dad would hire someone to do that sort of work. On Saturdays, I would help using one of the horses or one of the 2 mules to plow. Some of my cousins would come over to help. One of the funniest things I ever saw was when Mother took it upon herself to try and teach me how to hoe a plow. She watched Dad do it, but she never tilled the soil a day in her life. That plow was snapping her from side to side like a wet towel. I couldn't stop laughing for 2 straight hours. The 3 acres of cotton we had were to give my sister Nellie and me something to do. Agility and quickness of speed were required to produce a sack of cotton that amounted to something. I never scored well in that department. Even the incentive of earning some money didn't make a difference. One time I joined cousins Eddie, James, and Willie C., Uncle Namira's sons, to pick some cotton on another man's farm. They picked enough to make the trip worthwhile if I could have stayed at home, as I finished the day with a total of just 90 pounds. Another cousin of mine, Shelton Lucas, could pick 300 pounds in a day. My mother could not pick cotton either. Dad claimed we had too much white folks in us, that his way of saying we couldn't do it correctly. By the same token, he couldn't pick cotton any better than Mother and I could. After I watched him tire of trying a few times, I knew exactly why he chose to be a logger. But he did manage to grow plenty of food. Some of our relatives grew fruit. Mother, like all the women in the community, spent long hours canning food for the winter. On Sunday mornings, my parents, Nellie, and I would prepare to leave the house together and walk to church. Lucas Tabernacle Church of Christ Holiness remains one of the few remaining vestiges of history in Lucas. In my grandparents' time, the congregation had split from Shady Grove Baptist Church, the oldest church in the community, following a fiery preacher who stood in a wagon and that served as his pulpit. Our house faced the highway. As we walked out toward the church, Dad would turn and go in the opposite direction toward Silver Creek. Sometimes Dad would go to church with us instead, such as the time he was excommunicated from Lucas Tabernacle for smoking. He enjoyed his Camel cigarettes. After the service, you could catch up on the latest news in the community and talk to people you hadn't seen or heard from in a while. The after church activity was like a town hall meeting. The first I first learned of Tougaloo College at church. Dr. William Bender, who did outreach for the college, spoke to my parents about visiting the campus, telling them to be sure to ask for Mr. H.E. Dawkins, who was the registrar. Mom and Dad wanted nothing more than for my sister and me to attend Tougaloo. Jonas Johnson, the face of Prentice Institute in the community, also made regular appearances at various black local churches where he would spread the news about what was happening at the beloved high school for blacks. Parents could make arrangements with him to get their children admitted to the school. Dad pretty much left it up to Mom to raise me. Still, he was there to back her up. Mom's word was gospel. Though she was 7 years older than Dad, Mom was somewhat more modern in her thinking. Everybody was wild about B.B. King, who was just breaking out in the mid-50s. When he was scheduled to perform for the first time at the Black Masonic Hall in Jackson, my sister, who was in high school, begged Dad to let her go with her friends. Of course, he was of a different mind. It was only after Mom stepped in that Nellie got her wish to go. There is no questioning the fact that Mom raised me to be a gentleman in true Southern fashion. She insisted that I address a lady respectfully with the title Miss or Mrs. She encouraged me to offer my help to ladies I passed in the community. I soon learned that women talk to each other. Therefore, if I did a favor for one, whether she was young or an older lady, the whole community would eventually hear of it and offer praises. Almost every time I saw a woman, I had but one thing to say: "What can I do for you?" I swear Bob Dylan would have gotten the title of his song from me. Maybe I told him that story when we met in 1961. Before long, all the women of the community were telling each other that I was such a nice boy. Of course, all this worked to my benefit. I'll never forget Mother's advice to me once I began to think of having a girlfriend. Never become sexually active with a girl if you don't wish to marry her. I adhered to that policy. Most of the best looking girls in the community were relatives. A few were not, and I found them. We called almost everyone cousin, so we didn't address a potentially unknown relative incorrectly. Consequently, the exchange signaled the taboo associated with developing romantic feelings with a person of kin. One of the first girls I dreamed of kissing was a young lady named Princess Austen. Lo and behold, her mother and my father were cousins. Kinship ruined my chances with her. On the occasion when I took a female friend out on a date, we traveled in Dad's tandem axle log truck. It made for interesting conversations. Eleanor Bridges had never had a problem with my mode of transportation. She had a great personality. She lived 9 miles away in Lawrence County and attended a different high school. I would only see her on some weekends. Those days were wonderful. Sometimes I would visit her church, Pearl River Valley Baptist, then take her home in the log truck. I thought I've brought her home a few times. We'd sit in the swing on the porch. Mother liked Ella, and she thought we would get married. We didn't, and along came Phyllis McInnes, my pride and joy. We saw each other almost every day at Prentice Institute, where she came in as a freshman during my second year. The memorable moment was the high school prom. By this time, Mother had become impatient with the noise and other peculiarities of riding in the log truck and talked Dad into purchasing a 1956 Ford automobile. That was the car I happily drove to pick up Phyllis, my prom date. We were stunned to learn that 2 hours prior to our arrival, one of our schoolmates had been killed after driving off a bridge near the school. Another student who was a passenger was seriously injured. No high school prom was sadder than ours. We were sweethearts for most of the years in high school. Then, out of the blue, on the last day of school, I saw her with another guy. I was over as It was over as far as I was concerned. The betrayal cut me to the quick, but it wasn't the sort of thing I would take to my dad, even if he was one of the kindest and most generous humanitarians I had ever known. So, yeah, we're still going over some of his past, his growing up, um, how their family kind of earned their living, and his experience uh, in school. So, yeah, uh, we're getting to learn a little more about him. See, this chapter, I should be able to finish this chapter in the next episode. It's not much, very thin. It was about 5 pages. And then we go into education of Mississippi Negro. Do, 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 do. We do a lot of talking about a lot of pages there. And that brings us to part 2 of the book, which starts with chapter 4, Cornerstone Tougaloo. So, yeah, this first part of the book, these first 3 chapters, are just going to be seeing his development as a person. The second part is probably where we're going to see a lot more of his entrance into civil rights. But I'll go ahead and end this episode here. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, later.